You know, in the history of big ideas, some controversies are famous, they burn bright, and we never forget them. But others, they kind of just fade away, becoming a little more than a footnote. Today, we're going to pull one of those forgotten arguments, a heresy called Macedonianism, right back into the spotlight.
And it all kicks off with a name that sounds like it was pulled straight from an epic fantasy movie, the Combaters Against the Spirit. I mean, how intense is that? It sounds dramatic, for sure, but this was a very real group of people back in the 4th century. So who were these guys?
Okay, so the official, fancy Greek name was Pneumatomachian, and that literally translates to combaters against the spirit. This wasn't just some catchy nickname they got stuck with. No, this was a perfect description of a huge theological fight that basically blew up inside the early Christian church.
Right, so this was a major challenge happening in the 4th century that struck at the very heart of the Christian faith. And to really get what was at stake, we got to dig into who these combatars were and what they actually believed.
So the name we'll usually use, Macedonianism, comes from its founder, a guy named Macedonius, who was a bishop in Constantinople. And here's what's so interesting about their core belief. They weren't really arguing about Jesus Christ. In fact, a lot of them were totally on board with his divinity. Their fight, their combat, was aimed directly at the Holy Spirit. In their view, the Spirit was something God created. A powerful servant, sure, maybe even higher than the angels, but definitely, fundamentally, not God.
And you might be sitting there thinking, okay, so what? A super specific theological debate from like 1700 years ago, what's the big deal? Well, it was a big deal. Why did this one idea shake the early church to its absolute core?
The early church fathers saw this as a massive existential threat. So yeah, why was this belief, this idea of demoting the Holy Spirit, seen as so incredibly dangerous? This is where a really great analogy comes in. Think about it like this. The Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is like a three-legged stool. It's perfectly stable, right? Perfectly balanced. But what happens if you just saw one of those legs off? The whole thing just completely collapses. It can't stand. And that, right there, is exactly the problem they saw. By saying the Holy Spirit wasn't divine, Macedonianism wasn't just tweaking some minor detail. It was taking a saw to one of the legs of that stool. It was attacking the whole concept of who God is in Christianity. It undermined the central doctrine of the Trinity. To the church leaders, it looked a whole lot like the Arian heresy all over again, which had denied that the Son was divine. The principle was the same. If you say one person of the Godhead isn't really God, well, the whole idea of one God in three persons just falls apart.
So with a threat this big, this fundamental, the church absolutely did not mess around. The response was fast, it was smart, and it was incredibly well organized.
And I mean fast. This wasn't some slow-motion debate that dragged on for a century. Look at this timeline. Within just a couple of decades, the theological A-team of the day mobilized. You got St. Athanasius leading a council in Alexandria, you've got Pope Damasus I issuing condemnations from Rome, and then you have the absolute heavy hitters, St. Basil and Gregory of Nazianzen, writing these brilliant, powerful defenses. The greatest minds of the era were all laser-focused on this one thing, defending the divinity of the Holy Spirit.
So all of this, the letters, the sermons, the local meetings, it was all building up to something. It was all leading to one single, decisive moment, a moment where the church, as a whole, would speak with one unified voice.
381 AD. This year is absolutely pivotal in the history of Christianity.
And the event? It was the Second Ecumenical Council, which took place in Constantinople. Now, an ecumenical council is a big deal. It's a gathering of bishops from all over the Christian world, and they were called together specifically to tackle the big issues of the time, and you better believe Macedonianism was right at the top of their list. The council's strategy was brilliant, really. It was a two-pronged attack. First, on one hand, they officially and explicitly condemned the heresy and its followers. They drew a big, clear line in the sand. This is wrong. But then, on the other hand, and this is just as important, they fortified the faith. They didn't just tear something down, they built something stronger in its place. They didn't just say what was wrong, they made it crystal clear what was right. And how did they do that? Their solution was to actually add to the Nicene Creed the core statement of faith. They added this really precise, really powerful language about the Holy Spirit. And these are the very words that millions of Christians still say in church every single week. It's a direct result of this fight. The Spirit isn't some servant. He is the Lord, the giver of life.
So, the council's decision was a knockout blow.
The historical movement of Macedonianism was pretty much finished. But that brings up a good question. Do ideas like this ever really die?
As an actual organized group, yeah, the Macedonians basically vanished. They just faded away really fast after the council. Within a single generation, they were gone. You can chalk that up as a clear victory for Orthodox belief.
But let's dig a little deeper. The group might be gone, but what about the idea? The core mistake here, denying the full, co-equal nature of the Trinity, does that idea still echo today? Is it still around?
Well, the answer is a definite yes. You can look at several modern groups whose beliefs about God are very different from the traditional Trinitarian view. Now, to be clear, these groups aren't direct descendants of the Macedonians, but they do share that common thread, a rejection of that classic creedal definition of the Trinity that was fought for and defended so passionately back in the 4th century.
Okay, so if we look back at this whole historical showdown, what can we actually learn from it? What does it teach us about the best way to defend against these kinds of doctrinal challenges?
It seems like the Church developed a 3-part playbook. First, you have to have a clear, defining authority, like an ecumenical council, that can make the final call. Second, you need theological precision. You have to use incredibly clear language, like they did in the Creed, so there's no room for misinterpretation. And third, you have to ground everything in apostolic tradition. That is the faith that was handed down from the very beginning.
And really, it all came down to the belief that the church itself was set up to be what the Bible calls the pillar and bulwark of the truth. Its job was to protect that faith down through the centuries.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. This whole fight against Macedonianism, it wasn't just some dusty debate about words. It was about defining the absolute essence of God for every generation to come. So how does understanding the huge stakes of a 4th century debate change how we look at theological arguments today? It goes to show that sometimes the ideas we choose to fight for, or the ones we fail to defend, can end up echoing for thousands of years.